clock in the drawing room ticked away the seconds, unnoticed by the handful of guests who milled about the vast and dimly lit library. The manor, an aging yet imposing structure perched on the edge of a quiet English village, had been the setting for an elegant gathering just hours before. Now, however, it was silent, except for the occasional whisper or shuffle of feet on the well-worn rug beneath them. And yet, all was far from calm. At precisely 8:15 in the evening, the serene quiet was shattered when a scream echoed from the direction of the library. It was a high, strangled cry, the kind that jolts a person to their feet and sets their heart racing. The guests, previously lost in their own conversations or absorbed in the art books and old tomes that filled the room, froze. In an instant, they rushed toward the sound, eyes wide with panic, unsure of what they might find. They were met with an unexpected sight. A young woman, Miss Olivia Merrick, stood at the entrance to the library, her face drained of colour and her hand pressed to her mouth in horror. Behind her, the room itself seemed untouched by chaos, save for the body slumped in the far corner. It was that of Sir Anthony Carrington, a renowned historian and a frequent guest at the manor. His body was sprawled across the floor, a neat pool of blood gathering beneath him. The cause of death was immediately clear. He had been stabbed. The blade had been driven straight into his chest with brutal precision, yet it was the peculiarities of the scene that immediately caught the attention of those who arrived. The body was not positioned in a way that suggested a struggle. Sir Anthony's spectacles lay undisturbed on his face, and his fingers, though twitching in the throes of death, had not grasped at anything in a desperate attempt to save himself. There was an odd tranquility about the scene, as though he had simply collapsed, as if he had expected it. The most curious part, however, was the object near his body. A single page torn from a book, crumpled and carefully laid across his outstretched hand. It was an odd thing to leave behind, especially in such a brutal murder. The page was yellowed with age, a long and cryptic phrase written upon it in ink that had begun to fade over time. It was a fragment of an ancient poem, one not often seen in modern times, and its meaning was obscured by the fading ink. The guests hovered at the doorway, unsure of what to do. No one seemed to know who had committed the crime, or even why Sir Anthony had been targeted. It could have been a robbery gone wrong, but nothing was missing. His wallet, watch and rings all remained untouched. No one had heard anything. There had been no signs of forced entry. The mystery of it all left them frozen in place, hesitant to move, until the arrival of the one person who might help. Miss Marple. The local village had long been acquainted with the sharp mind and quiet presence of Miss Jane Marple, whose subtlety and profound understanding of human nature often led to the unraveling of the most confounding mysteries. Her reputation had grown in recent years, and when the call came, it was as though she had been waiting for it all along. She arrived at the manor within an hour, a small woman in a simple coat, her face a study of serenity, though her eyes were sharp as ever. Her arrival immediately brought a sense of calm to the troubled group in the library. With a few quiet words of introduction to the guests, none of whom she had ever met, Miss Marple took in the room. She seemed to observe the small details. With great interest, her eyes flitting over the pages of the book Sir Anthony had been holding, to the untouched shelves, the peculiar arrangement of furniture, and finally to the body itself. "Miss Merrick," she began softly, turning toward the young woman who had discovered the body, "could you tell me what happened?" What led you to find Mr. Carrington? The young woman hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she recounted the events of the evening. She had been in the drawing room conversing with others when she had heard a noise, a sort of thud, coming from the library. When she had gone to investigate, she had found Sir Anthony lying there, already lifeless. And you saw nothing else? Miss Marple pressed, her voice calm, though there was a subtle intensity behind her words. Olivia shook her head. No, just the body. Miss Marple took a moment to consider the scene before speaking again, her voice still measured and clear. It is interesting that you found him here in the library. Sir Anthony was not known for spending much time in this room. It is odd that he would have been alone here, particularly this evening. The guests exchanged uneasy glances. It was true. Sir Anthony had always been a man of particular habits. He rarely strayed from his study or the gardens, and he had been a recent guest at the manor. He had never been particularly drawn to the library. Do you think it was someone he knew? One of the other guests asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. Instead, she asked the others to recount their movements during the evening. It was a tedious process, each person speaking in turn, but nothing stood out. No one had seen anyone leave the library. No one had heard anything suspicious. Miss Marple, Olivia spoke again, her voice tight with nerves. What about the clue? Miss Marple moved toward the body and the crumpled page in Sir Anthony's hand, bending slightly to inspect it. Her eyes softened as they traced the faded ink. She nodded slowly. It appears that this was deliberately placed here, but not by the victim himself. The positioning of the body suggests something else entirely. Perhaps Sir Anthony had something of value in his knowledge or work that he was unwilling to give up, and his murderer sought to extract it. But why leave the page behind? Another guest asked. That, Miss Marple said, standing straight and regarding the group with a knowing gaze, is what we must understand. Miss Marple stood over Sir Anthony's body, her eyes fixed on the crumpled page in his hand. The faint scent of leather-bound books and polished wood filled the room, but her mind was elsewhere, sifting through the small details that others had overlooked. The guests whispered nervously, their presence almost forgotten as Miss Marple remained still, as though she were listening for something just beyond hearing. The constable, a young man with a serious expression, had begun the routine procedure of taking notes. He'd called for a doctor, and his partner was already questioning the witnesses. The manor's owners, the Carringtons, were standing quietly by the door, looking as though they had aged years in the last half hour. They hadn't spoken much, their faces drawn in fear and confusion. The atmosphere was thick with the unanswered question of how and why Sir Anthony had been murdered in their own home. Miss Marple's gaze flickered briefly to the window. The night had settled in around them like a cloak, the faint shadows cast by the moon lending the room an eerie stillness. Despite the disarray, everything seemed so undisturbed. There was no sign of the usual chaos that follows a violent death. No overturned furniture, no broken glass. And yet, the tension in the room was palpable, like a wire drawn too tight. The page in Sir Anthony's hand intrigued her, but it was the position of his body, the subtle manner in which it was splayed, that kept drawing her attention. She crouched near the body and examined the blood-stained carpet carefully. The way his arms were stretched outward, the palms open, but relaxed, told her something critical. Sir Anthony had not been struggling when he was attacked. The knife wound was deep, precise, but there were no signs of frantic defense. Her fingers brushed the edge of a small silver item just a foot away from the body, an antique pocket watch. The smooth, polished surface glimmered faintly in the dim light. It was odd, she thought. Sir Anthony had always been known for his punctuality, but this watch didn't appear to belong to him. There was no matching indentation in his pocket where it might have fallen from. Someone had left it behind, or perhaps it had been placed deliberately to confuse the investigation. "Constable," Miss Marple spoke up, her voice steady but with an edge of inquiry. "Could I see the watch?" The constable looked up, surprised that she had noticed it. He nodded and handed it to her. She turned it over slowly, noting the inscription on the back. It was faint, but readable. "To G.R. with fond regards, from L.A. Do you know whose this is?" she asked, her gaze lifting to the group of guests, her question aimed at the nearest of them. The young man who had asked earlier if it could have been someone Sir Anthony knew stepped forward, his brow furrowing. I've never seen it before." Miss Marple studied the watch one last time before handing it back. "Curious," she murmured. "Perhaps it will mean something later." The constable, eager to stay on task, continued his work, inspecting the rest of the room. Miss Marple turned her attention back to the group, the flicker of suspicion growing in her chest. They were all hiding something, but the question was, what? She began by speaking with the Carringtons. Sir Anthony had been a long-time acquaintance of theirs, and though they had invited him as a guest, their manner suggested they were less than comfortable. Mrs. Carrington, her eyes still red from shock, clung tightly to her husband's arm as Miss Marple asked her questions. "Did Sir Anthony have any enemies?" Miss Marple asked softly, her gaze never leaving Mrs. Carrington's face. Mrs. Carrington blinked rapidly, as though the question was a blow she hadn't expected. "No, not that I know of," she said, her voice shaking. He was well liked by everyone, a bit aloof but kind." Her husband, a tall man with greying hair, nodded in agreement. Sir Anthony was a quiet man, but he had no reason to make enemies here or anywhere else for that matter. Miss Marple let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking again. "Was there anything unusual about his behaviour today? Anything that might have seemed out of place?" The Carringtons exchanged an unreadable look before Mr. Carrington answered, though his voice lacked certainty. "Well, I did overhear him talking to someone in the garden earlier this afternoon. It was brief. I didn't hear the content of the conversation, but he seemed agitated. But it could have been nothing." "Who was he speaking with?" Miss Marple asked. "That's the strange part," Mrs. Carrington chimed in, her voice suddenly tight. "I couldn't tell. I didn't recognize the person. They both kept their distance." Miss Marple didn't press further, but filed away the information. An unrecognized figure, agitating Sir Anthony in some way. This was a lead, but it was nothing more than a vague impression at this point. Turning her attention to the other guests, Miss Marple's keen eyes caught something that none of them seemed to notice. A man in the corner of the room, Dr. Arthur Havisham, an old friend of the Carringtons, had been standing by the fireplace, staring into the flames, his expression blank. His hands were clasped behind his back, but as she watched, his eyes flickered quickly to the bookcase beside him. It was a fleeting glance, barely perceptible, but it struck Miss Marple immediately. She approached him with an air of casual ease, her voice pleasant but probing. "Dr. Havisham, you seem quite deep in thought," she remarked, watching him stiffen. "Is something on your mind?" He straightened and gave her a polite smile, but there was an unmistakable wariness in his eyes. I was just considering the tragedy. It's hard to believe Sir Anthony is gone. Indeed, Miss Marple said, nodding thoughtfully. But I couldn't help but notice you seemed distracted just now. Was there something about the bookshelf that caught your attention? Dr. Havisham blinked, his expression faltering. No, not at all. I was simply thinking, I believe I should return to my study. I find it hard to focus in such a setting. Miss Marple studied him for a moment longer, before letting him slip away. His reaction too quick, too defensive. There was something amiss. He had been too eager to change the subject. Miss Marple, the constable said, approaching again, we've searched the room. There's nothing more we can find here. She nodded, though her mind was already miles ahead, piecing together the puzzle in her mind. You've done well, Constable, but there's still much to uncover. This is not a simple crime. There are layers to it, hidden motives, secret conversations, and misplaced objects that will all tell their own story in time. As she turned to face the group once more, Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. She had just begun to untangle the web of deception that surrounded Sir Anthony's murder, and she was certain that the key to solving it lay in something far more subtle than anyone had yet realized. The investigation continued into the late hours, with the night air growing colder and the shadows deepening inside the manor. Miss Marple had retired briefly to the small sitting room adjacent to the library, where she had requested tea to steady her thoughts. Her mind, however, was far from restful. It was filled with the whispers of contradictions, the subtle reactions, and the careful but often shaky words of the witnesses and suspects. She knew that the answers lay somewhere within those words, within the small, seemingly insignificant moments when the truth slipped through the cracks. The constable had gathered, the guests now sitting around the drawing-room, each looking more nervous than the last. None of them had been allowed to leave, not until Miss Marple was satisfied with her understanding of the events that had transpired. The initial shock of the murder had worn off, replaced with an atmosphere of tense curiosity. Each person, whether they realized it or not, was playing a part in a delicate dance of deception. Miss Marple's first target was Olivia Merrick, the young woman who had found the body. She had been remarkably composed for someone who had stumbled upon such a gruesome scene. Her previous retelling of the events had been straightforward, but now, as Miss Marple spoke with her privately, the cracks began to show. Miss Merrick, you mentioned before that you found Sir Anthony lying there in the library, but could you tell me more about how you discovered the body? Miss Marple asked, her voice kind but probing. Olivia shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Her hands twisted, the hem of her dress as she avoided Miss Marple's gaze. I already told you, she said, her voice faltering slightly. I just heard a sound, like a thud, and when I went in, he was there. And before you heard the sound, what were you doing? You were in the drawing room, weren't you? Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle but insistent. Olivia hesitated for a moment too long. Yes, I was talking to some of the other guests. I don't remember exactly who, she added quickly. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. You don't remember exactly who? That seems odd for someone who was engaged in a conversation only moments before. Was there anything that might have distracted you? Olivia's eyes flickered. No. I mean, I wasn't distracted, but... She stopped herself, biting her lip as though she had almost said too much. Go on, Miss Merrick, Miss Marple prompted. What is it that you were about to say?" Olivia looked up at Miss Marple with wide, nervous eyes. "I wasn't the only one who heard something. Someone else." She paused again, her expression clouding with uncertainty. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Who else, Miss Merrick? Who else might have heard the sound you mentioned?" Olivia took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "I'm not sure, but I think I heard someone else walking down the hall just before I went into the library. It was quick, almost as though they were trying to leave quietly." "Did you see anyone? Could you identify the person?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but laced with an unspoken urgency. "No," Olivia replied quickly. "I didn't see anyone." Miss Marple sat back, contemplating the young woman's words. There was an unease in Olivia's voice that hinted at more, but whether she was withholding information or merely unsure of what she had heard, Miss Marple couldn't say for certain. She allowed a few moments of silence to pass, then stood. "Thank you, Miss Merrick. I may have more questions for you later." The young woman nodded, looking more relieved than before. Miss Marple turned away, but before she could leave the room, she caught Olivia's eyes for a brief moment, a flicker of something just beneath the surface. Fear, guilt, she couldn't quite tell, but it made her pause. "Miss Merrick," she said, her voice soft but clear, "do you know anything about the silver pocket watch we found near Sir Anthony's body?" Olivia blinked as though startled by the question. "No, I didn't see it." "Are you sure?" Miss Marple pressed. "It seems to be connected to the murder in some way, though I haven't yet figured out how." Olivia shook her head, her face pale. "I swear, I know nothing about it." Miss Marple smiled, but there was a sharpness behind it. "Thank you. You've been very helpful." The next person to question was Dr. Arthur Havisham. He had been an unlikely witness, detached and withdrawn, yet his earlier reaction to the bookshelf had not escaped Miss Marple's notice. She had seen him glance at it, his eyes betraying some hidden thought. Now she sought to discover what it was he knew, or at least what he was hiding. He was sitting stiffly on a chair by the window, his posture rigid, and his hands clasped together tightly in his lap. When Miss Marple entered, he looked up, and though he tried to conceal it, the brief flicker of discomfort in his eyes was unmistakable. "Dr. Havisham," Miss Marple began, her voice smooth, "I understand you were close to Sir Anthony. You must be devastated by this tragic loss." He nodded, but it was clear he wasn't entirely engaged in the sentiment. "Yes, of course. It's unfortunate. I wonder if you might be able to help clarify something for me," Miss Marple continued, her voice lowering as if sharing a private thought. "Earlier you appeared distracted when we spoke. You glanced at the bookshelf. Was there something on your mind?" His hands tightened, but his expression remained neutral. "No, I was simply thinking about the situation. The shock, I suppose." His voice was too smooth, too rehearsed. "I see," Miss Marple said, her tone unchanged. "But it wasn't the shock that caught your attention, was it, Dr. Havisham? It was something on the bookshelf. Perhaps a book or a note, something you weren't expecting to see." Dr. Havisham's gaze hardened, and for a brief moment, his composure cracked. "I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple tilted her head, her gaze never leaving his face. "I think you do, Doctor. It's quite all right to be unsettled by what's been found. But you must understand, if you know something, anything about Sir Anthony's death, it's far better to tell me now." His jaw clenched. He stood abruptly, pacing away from her. "I don't know anything, Miss Marple. You're Wasting your time, am I? She asked softly but firmly. Or are you hiding something, Doctor? He stopped, turning toward her with a look that could almost have been one of regret. I'm not hiding anything, he said, voice tight with tension. Miss Marple watched him closely. His reaction, the tightness in his voice, and his sudden defensiveness were too telling. She didn't need him to say more. She had already gleaned that he was lying, or at least covering something up. There was something, some small detail, that he had not shared with her, and it was this lie, this omission, that would lead her closer to the truth. Thank you for your time, Dr. Havisham, she said, her voice light but resolute. I may need to speak with you again. As he nodded curtly and turned away, Miss Marple's thoughts whirred with the pieces of the puzzle she had collected. Each one of them was hiding something, each one had a motive that was just out of reach. But it was only a matter of time before the truth, no matter how carefully veiled, would surface. The air in the drawing-room felt heavier as Miss Marple returned, the weight of the night pressing down on her shoulders. Her mind was racing, piecing together the jumbled motives that tangled like threads in a web. Each person she had spoken to seemed to hold a clue, yet nothing tied them together in a clear way. There was no single theory that explained the crime in full. Greed, jealousy, fear. Each of the suspects had a motive, but none of them alone could account for Sir Anthony's death. No one was completely innocent, and yet no one seemed to have the perfect answer either. Miss Marple stood by the window, staring out at the darkened garden, her thoughts whirling like a storm. She had learned much about each of them, the Carringtons, Olivia Merrick, Dr. Havisham, but there were still many things unsaid. Too many contradictions in their accounts. She knew the answers lay buried beneath those contradictions, and it was only a matter of time before she could sift through them all to reveal the truth. The constable had been hard at work gathering alibis, confirming stories, but so far nothing added up in a way that provided clarity. Olivia Merrick's story about hearing a thud before finding the body was plausible, but why had she been so vague about the conversation she'd been having beforehand? And why had she been unable to identify the mysterious person she'd heard? The young woman's nerves were hard to ignore, but Miss Marple had to wonder whether it was fear or guilt that had caused her to fumble. Dr. Havisham, too, was a puzzle. He had been agitated when questioned, defensive about the bookshelf, and yet his position in the room had given him an excellent vantage point to see things no one else could. It was not just a casual glance. He had been deep in thought about something, but what? He had motive, certainly. Sir Anthony had been a respected figure, and any resentment between the two men could be a motive for murder. But Miss Marple didn't believe Dr. Havisham had the stomach for such violence. No, there was something else there, a hidden detail he was hiding behind his calm facade. And then there were the Carringtons. The couple had shown an almost too perfect display of concern, too eager to assist. Mrs. Carrington had wept when she first learned of Sir Anthony's death, but Miss Marple had noticed her husband's tight control. Mr. Carrington had always maintained a quiet, observant demeanour, but his earlier claim that he didn't know anyone who would want to harm Sir Anthony didn't ring true. There was something in his eyes, a fleeting hesitation when the question had been asked, that made Miss Marple wonder if he was hiding something more than grief. But the most baffling part of it all was the pocket watch. Miss Marple hadn't yet figured out its true significance, but the inscription, "To G.R. with fond regards from L.A.," kept circling back in her mind. It was a personal gift, from someone who knew Sir Anthony intimately, but the connection was still unclear. Miss Marple knew that in a case like this, nothing was random, and the presence of the watch by Sir Anthony's body was too deliberate to ignore. As she turned back toward the room, she found the constable waiting, a fresh batch of alibis in hand. He passed her a sheet of paper, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Miss Marple," he said, "I've managed to confirm some alibis, though some are still shaky. Dr. Havisham was at the table with Mrs. Carrington when Sir Anthony's body was discovered, but the timing of his movements is unclear. Olivia Merrick was in the drawing room with the Carringtons just before finding the body, though she can't pinpoint the exact time. As for the Carringtons, they claim to have been in the study, but no one saw them until the body was found." Miss Marple glanced at the alibis, nodding thoughtfully. "It's not surprising. No one seems to have a solid timeline, do they?" The constable scratched his head. "No, Miss Marple. It's all very odd. Everyone claims to have been with someone else, but no one can corroborate each other's story fully." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her mind racing. It was as if they were all trying to create a barrier of confusion, hoping the details would remain muddled. But somewhere in the haze, the truth waited to be uncovered. She took a deep breath, the pieces of the puzzle slowly shifting in her mind. "I believe it's time we address the issue of motives more directly," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but firm. "Each one of them has something to hide, something to gain from Sir Anthony's death. But we need to be careful how we approach it. We cannot allow them to deflect suspicion with half-truths and evasions." The next morning, Miss Marple gathered the suspects in the drawing room once again, her presence as steady as the ticking of the grandfather clock against the wall. The house felt quieter now, the air heavy with anticipation. Each person filed in, reluctant, but knowing they had no choice but to face the inevitable questions. Miss Marple watched them carefully as they took their seats. Olivia Merrick sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes darting nervously between the others. Dr. Havisham, as always, kept his hands clasped tightly in front of him, though Miss Marple could sense the tension in his posture. The Carringtons appeared more collected than the others, but their eyes betrayed something else. Anxiety, perhaps, or guilt. "I believe we are at a crossroads," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but clear, each word carrying weight. "There is no simple explanation for Sir Anthony's death. It is a tangled web of motives and actions, each of which must be examined closely." She let her words hang in the air for a moment, letting the tension build. Then she turned to Olivia. "Miss Merrick," she began, "you mentioned hearing a noise, but you couldn't identify the person you heard. Why is that? You seem certain about the sound, yet hesitant to explain the circumstances surrounding it." Olivia flinched, the colour draining from her face. I didn't want to say anything, but now that you've asked, I think it was Dr. Havisham I heard, or someone very close to him." Miss Marple turned her gaze to the doctor, her eyes sharp. "Dr. Havisham? Do you have anything to say about that?" He stiffened, his expression faltering for a brief second. "I was in the study with Mr. and Mrs. Carrington. I never left." "But that isn't entirely true, is it?" Miss Marple said gently, her voice laced with understanding. "Your alibi is not as solid as you might think. I suspect you went to the library, and for some reason you wanted to ensure that Sir Anthony would not be found alive." Dr. Havisham's face remained stoic, but the subtle twitch in his jaw gave him away. I had nothing to do with it. Miss Marple nodded, though she wasn't convinced. But you do have a motive, Doctor. Sir Anthony was close to exposing. Something you wished to keep hidden, wasn't he? The room was silent as all eyes turned to Dr. Havisham, but it was Olivia who spoke next, her voice shaking. He was angry with Dr. Havisham. Sir Anthony. They had an argument in the garden. Earlier, I overheard a few words. Sir Anthony had found something in Havisham's past, something he was going to reveal. Dr. Havisham's gaze darkened. You don't know what you're talking about. Miss Marple leaned forward, her expression unreadable. Maybe not, Doctor, but I think we're getting closer to the truth. A past full of secrets, a watch that doesn't belong to the victim, and motives that stretch in all directions. It's not just a coincidence that all of you have something to gain from Sir Anthony's death. The room was thick with tension now, each person waiting for the next revelation. Miss Marple could feel the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place, one by one. The truth, however tangled, was no longer far out of reach. The room was filled with a palpable sense of anticipation as Miss Marple sat quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The tension among the suspects had only grown since her pointed remarks, their eyes now lingering on one another with a wariness that hadn't been there before. The air felt heavier, and for a moment Miss Marple allowed herself to close her eyes, taking in the quiet hum of their uneasy silence. She was certain they were all hiding something, each of them with a reason to see Sir Anthony dead. But what? She didn't yet know. What still evaded her was who among them had crossed that final line. The constable entered, his face flushed with the excitement of what he believed to be a breakthrough. He approached Miss Marple, holding up a small folded envelope, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. Miss Marple, we've found something, he said breathlessly, handing her the envelope. A letter. It was hidden in Sir Anthony's desk, tucked under a stack of papers. It seems to confirm a lot of our suspicions. Miss Marple unfolded the letter slowly, scanning the neat handwriting. It was dated only a few days prior from a woman named G.R., the same initials found on the pocket watch. Her pulse quickened, but she remained still, focusing on the words in front of her. The letter was a confession of sorts. It detailed Sir Anthony's knowledge of a betrayal, one that had occurred between the writer and someone else within the house. The writer had been threatened with exposure, but now, with Sir Anthony's death, it appeared they had succeeded in silencing him. The language was clear, direct, and contained several mentions of revenge. There was no question that the letter implicated someone with a personal vendetta. Miss Marple felt a small spark of triumph, but it was fleeting. The constable, clearly reading her expression, spoke eagerly. Sir Anthony must have been on the verge of exposing this person. This letter, it's a clear motive. We have everything we need now. I'm certain of it. The case is solved, Miss Marple. But Miss Marple wasn't so sure. Her mind was already working through the details, the small discrepancies in the letter that set her instinct off. She had learned long ago to trust her gut, and it was telling her that something about this breakthrough didn't quite fit. Her eyes flicked to the faces of the suspects, all of them now staring at the letter in the constable's hand, their expressions ranging from mild surprise to barely concealed anxiety. She took a deep breath before responding. Yes, this letter certainly provides a strong lead. But before we jump to conclusions, I must ask, how did this letter come to be in Sir Anthony's desk, and why was it hidden under a stack of papers? If it were truly meant to be discovered, why would it have been so carefully concealed? The constable faltered, momentarily taken aback by her question. Well, Miss Marple, it could be that Sir Anthony was keeping it as leverage, intending to use it later. He might have been waiting for the right moment to confront the writer. It makes sense, doesn't it? Miss Marple nodded slowly, but her eyes remained sharp. It makes sense, yes. But it also raises another question. Why would the writer, someone who clearly had a reason to kill Sir Anthony, leave such a damning piece of evidence behind? Why risk it being found at all? The constable hesitated, his confidence faltering. I don't know, Miss Marple. I hadn't thought of that. Miss Marple stood, her eyes sweeping over the room as she spoke again, her voice soft but firm. If someone were trying to frame another person, to create the illusion of guilt, this letter would be the perfect piece of evidence. A letter with just enough information to point to a suspect, but not enough to fully clear the picture. It could lead us down a path that seems right, but in truth, it's a distraction. The constable's face darkened. So you're saying it's a fake, a plant? Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him, studying his reaction. I'm not sure yet, but I'm not convinced that this letter tells us everything we need to know. I believe we're still missing something crucial. The room was silent for a moment, as if everyone had collectively held their breath. No one spoke, and even the constable seemed to shrink slightly under Miss Marple's calm but unwavering scrutiny. He had hoped this letter would be the key to unraveling the mystery. But Miss Marple wasn't ready to settle for an easy answer. She could sense the deeper layers of deception still hiding in the shadows. It was late afternoon when Miss Marple decided to take a different approach. She'd spent hours thinking over the evidence, and though the letter had been a promising lead, it didn't explain the contradictions she had observed in the behavior of the suspects. There was something about the way each person reacted to the discovery of the letter, their eagerness or reluctance to speak, that didn't sit right with her. The real killer was still among them, and Miss Marple knew that whatever had been uncovered in that letter was not the whole truth. She requested that all the suspects be gathered once again in the drawing room. The Carringtons entered together, their faces tightly controlled, though there was a slight wariness in their eyes now. Olivia Merrick followed, her gaze darting nervously between the others, and Dr. Havisham entered last, his face as inscrutable as ever. Miss Marple watched them closely as they settled into their seats. I've thought about the letter, Miss Marple began, her voice steady but thoughtful. And while it provides some insight into the possible motives for Sir Anthony's death, it doesn't explain everything. I believe we are being led down a false path, and we must look beyond what has been presented to us. The suspects exchanged glances, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others looking resolute. Miss Marple's eyes landed on each of them, taking in their reactions. Let's return to the basics, she continued. We know that Sir Anthony was a man with many connections, many enemies, and a great deal of influence. His death was not a random act. Someone had a reason to kill him, a reason to ensure his silence. She turned to the Carringtons. Mr. Carrington, you have business dealings that were closely tied to Sir Anthony. Could that have played a part in his death? Mr. Carrington stiffened, his jaw tightening slightly. Our dealings were professional. I don't see how they could have anything to do with this. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Of course they were professional, but were they always entirely honest? The tension in the room grew, and Mrs. Carrington's eyes flickered to her husband before she quickly composed herself. "We've told you everything we know," she said, her voice tight with restraint. Miss Marple turned her attention to Dr. Havisham next. "You, Doctor, had a personal history with Sir Anthony. There was something between you two that the others didn't know. Isn't that right?" Dr. Havisham's face remained a mask, but his lips pressed together in a thin line. Sir Anthony was a colleague, nothing more. "And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "his discovery of something in your past could have been enough to destroy you, couldn't it, Doctor? Enough to drive you to silence him?" Dr. Havisham said nothing, but his eyes darted briefly to the letter in the constable's hand, and Miss Marple saw the smallest flicker of uncertainty there. Miss Marple took a step back, her mind turning, the puzzle over. "The letter points us toward a possible motive, but it's not the full story. It's a deliberate misdirection, and the true culprit is still out there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment." The room was once again silent, but now Miss Marple felt the subtle shift in the air. The killer was close too, close to be easily detected. She would need more than just a letter to solve this case. It was the small, forgotten details that would lead her to the real criminal. And she knew that with each passing moment, the shadow of the true culprit was drawing nearer. The evening had deepened, and the house felt colder somehow, as though the secrets it held were beginning to weigh heavily on its very walls. Miss Marple stood by the fireplace, watching the flames dance and flicker, her mind still restless despite the progress she had made in unraveling the tangled motives. The letter had seemed like a breakthrough, a key piece to unravel the mystery, but it had only raised more questions than it answered. Each suspect remained as elusive as before, hiding behind carefully constructed alibis and polished stories. Yet something nagged at Miss Marple, a small detail that had been overlooked. She couldn't put her finger on it yet, but she knew that the answer was close. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach like a faint echo that had long been ignored. It wasn't until she had retired to her room for the night that the thought hit her, something about the pocket watch, the inscription. It wasn't just a casual gift. To Gr with fond regards from L.A. The initials had nagged at her from the start, but she had been too focused on the present to consider their deeper significance. Now, as she lay in the dim light of her room, the realization clicked into place. L.A. It wasn't a person, it was a place. Lafayette. Lafayette, as in the small village where Sir Anthony had grown up. The connection was immediate, clear in her mind now. But why had Sir Anthony kept this watch? And why had he hidden it so carefully? And more importantly, why had the killer wanted it to be discovered so badly? Miss Marple's thoughts moved quickly, piecing together the years she had spent observing people, remembering their stories, and most importantly, their forgotten histories. It wasn't just about the present crime. The answer lay in the past. The killer had been hiding behind an old connection, one that no one had thought to question. The next morning, Miss Marple requested a meeting with the constable. The hour was early, and he looked somewhat groggy as he entered her room, but she wasted no time. "Constable, I believe I've uncovered something," Miss Marple began, her voice firm, the weight of her discovery clear. "We've been looking at this case from the wrong angle. The key to understanding Sir Anthony's murder lies not in the letter or the watch alone, but in a connection that dates back many years. A forgotten case, one that ties our suspects together in a way no one has considered. The constable's eyes widened, and he immediately sat up straighter. His attention peaked. "What are you saying, Miss Marple? Take a look at the village of Lafayette. Sir Anthony grew up there, and I believe he may have uncovered something about the past of several people in this room. I need you to go through the local records, particularly regarding a scandal that occurred many years ago. It's something I've remembered only now, and I think it's crucial to our case." The constable nodded, though his face was still full of confusion. "A scandal? What sort of scandal?" Miss Marple hesitated for a moment before responding. "It's not a matter of public record, I'm afraid. It was a case that was swept under the rug, a crime of passion. But I'm certain it's at the root of everything that has happened here." Hours later, the constable returned, bearing a dusty ledger of old news clippings and reports. His face was grave as he handed Miss Marple a thick folder. "I found it," he said quietly. There was a scandal indeed, a tragic affair with far-reaching consequences. Miss Marple took the folder, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she flipped through the yellowed pages. The article was about a woman named Lily Ashford, who had been involved in a torrid affair with a prominent man in Lafayette years ago. The affair had caused a great deal of scandal, and when the affair was discovered, Lily Ashford had been publicly humiliated. But it wasn't just the affair that piqued Miss Marple's interest. It was the name of the man involved, the man who had been Lily Ashford's lover. It was none other than the late Sir Anthony's father, Geoffrey Radcliffe. The affair had ruined Lily, and Geoffrey had done everything in his power to cover it up, even going so far as to force her to leave town under threat of disgrace. The scandal had never been fully investigated, and the press had been instructed to bury it. Sir Anthony's father had protected his family's reputation at any cost, and Lily Ashford had vanished from the public eye. But the consequences of that affair had never been erased. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she turned the pages. Geoffrey Radcliffe had promised to provide for Lily, but after the affair had been exposed, she had been cast aside. The affair had destroyed her life. She had never spoken out about it, but Miss Marple was beginning to see how deeply the past had woven itself into the present. Her eyes lingered on a detail in one of the reports. It seemed that, after Geoffrey's death, Sir Anthony had become involved in a legal matter regarding Lily Ashford's son. The son's name? Gabriel Ashford. Gabriel Ashford had been a quiet and resentful figure in the community, known for his occasional outbursts and his attempts to find his mother after her disappearance. He had spent years trying to find her, but the Radcliffes had made sure no one could locate her. The records were unclear about his motivations, but it was evident that he blamed Sir Anthony's father for the ruin of his mother's life. It was a long-buried connection, a hidden link between Sir Anthony and the Ashford family that had never been exposed. And now, in this very house, the shadow of the past had come creeping back to life. Miss Marple gathered the suspects once again, the weight of the past pressing on her shoulders. The house was quiet, the air thick with anticipation, as she looked each of them in the eye. She had pieced together enough of the puzzle now to know what had truly happened, but there was still one final thread she needed to pull. "I've been investigating the origins of the conflict between Sir Anthony and some of you," Miss Marple began, her voice calm and steady. "What I've uncovered might surprise you. It seems that the seeds of this murder were sown many years ago, in the scandal that surrounded Sir Anthony's father." She paused, letting her words sink in. The constable had already filled in the gaps for her, and now the suspects were looking. at each other with growing suspicion. The affair between Geoffrey Radcliffe and Lily Ashford, well, it ruined Lily's life. But it also left behind a son, Gabriel Ashford, who spent years trying to uncover the truth of what had happened. Sir Anthony, upon learning of this man's quest, had gone so far as to try and track down Gabriel, hoping to make amends for his father's actions. Miss Marple's gaze flickered from one suspect to the next, watching their faces carefully. Mr. Carrington's expression tightened, while Olivia Merrick shifted uncomfortably in her seat. It was clear that none of them had expected this revelation. And it seems, Miss Marple continued, that someone here had a very personal reason for wanting to silence Sir Anthony. Gabriel Ashford, whether known to you all or not, was hiding in plain sight. His desire for vengeance had come to a head. The silence in the room was deafening now, as each person began to realize the gravity of Miss Marple's words. Gabriel Ashford had been more than a mere suspect. He had been a shadow in the past, a figure whose unresolved pain had driven him to murder. And in that moment, Miss Marple knew everything. The web of lies and deceptions, the motives and hidden truths, had come full circle. The past was never truly gone. It only waited for the right moment to strike. The room had grown heavy with tension, the air thick with unspoken truths and the weight of old grievances. The suspects exchanged uneasy glances, their faces masks of innocence, yet Miss Marple could see the cracks beneath their composed exteriors. Gabriel Ashford, in particular, was no longer the quiet figure he had once been. His earlier silence had been replaced by a restlessness that seemed to ripple through the room. His eyes darted to the door, and then back to the others, as though searching for a way out. The others were beginning to fidget too, their discomfort palpable. Miss Marple stood before them, her expression serene but sharp. She had woven a story that seemed to tie everything together, almost everything. But there was one more thing that troubled her, one last detail that didn't quite sit right. Gabriel Ashford might have been the instigator, the vengeful son, seeking retribution. But Miss Marple was certain there was more to the story. There was something about the reactions of the others, the way they seemed so eager to point the finger at Ashford, the way they avoided looking too closely at each other, that made her suspect a deeper deception. Her eyes swept over the group once more, resting for a moment on Olivia Merrick. The young woman had been strangely quiet since the revelation of the old scandal. While the others had reacted with varying degrees of shock and fear, Olivia's expression had been guarded, almost too composed. She hadn't shown the genuine distress that would be expected from someone who had just learned the truth about a connection so deeply tied to their own life. Her calmness, instead of reassuring Miss Marple, only raised more suspicion. The detective needed a way to break through this polished exterior, to test the reactions of those present without them even realizing they were being tested. There had to be something they weren't saying, something they hadn't revealed yet. She needed to find the thread that would unravel the rest of the mystery. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled slightly as she turned to the constable, who had been standing by silently, his hands folded in front of him. "Constable," she began in her usual calm voice, "I'd like to suggest a small experiment, something I believe might reveal more than we've been able to gather through conventional means. If you would, please." The constable, though puzzled, nodded. "What do you have in mind, Miss Marple?" "I would like you to take this small bottle of perfume," she said, reaching for her handbag. "It's a simple scent, but I'm curious about the reactions it might provoke. Could you please offer it to each of our guests here one by one? and ask them to describe it for us? I don't expect detailed answers, but I do want to see how they react. Perhaps some of them might notice something that the others won't. The constable, somewhat confused but trusting her instinct, nodded again. Very well. The room fell into a heavy silence as the constable began his task, offering the bottle to the first suspect, Olivia Merrick. She took it with an air of practiced composure, uncapping it and inhaling slowly, her lips curling into a small, satisfied smile. "It's lavender," she said, her voice smooth, her tone not a hint of hesitation. "Quite pleasant, really." The constable nodded, his eyes moving to the next person, Gabriel Ashford. He was sitting slightly apart from the others, his posture stiff. When the bottle was offered to him, his gaze flickered toward it before he took it hesitantly. He raised it to his nose, inhaling deeply, and his face briefly twitched in discomfort. His response was slow, as though he was carefully considering his words. "It smells like roses," he muttered, his voice slightly strained. "A bit overpowering, though." The constable moved on, offering the bottle to Mr. Carrington, who took it with a hint of suspicion. He sniffed it, frowned, and then shrugged nonchalantly. "Lavender, I suppose. It's a little too floral for my taste." Then, to Miss Marple's surprise, the constable moved to Margaret Drake. She was the last in line, and she took the bottle without so much as a glance toward the others. Her reaction was swift, and her face betrayed no emotion as she sniffed the perfume, her eyes narrowing for just a moment. She did not immediately speak. Instead, her eyes darted to the others as though searching for a cue. Miss Marple observed the flicker of anxiety that passed across Margaret's face, a brief moment of vulnerability that seemed out of place for the otherwise confident woman. When she spoke, her voice was tight as though she was forcing the words out. "It smells different," she said, her gaze quickly shifting back to the constable. "Not what I expected, but roses, I suppose." Miss Marple's mind raced. The inconsistencies in the reactions were subtle, but they were there. Gabriel Ashford's discomfort, the slight hesitation in Margaret Drake's response, and most telling of all, Olivia Merrick's almost perfect calm. These were the cracks she had been waiting for. The perfume was a trivial detail, but it had exposed something deeper, something none of the suspects had consciously meant to reveal. It was the roses. Every person had identified the scent, but the way Margaret had reacted to it, the way she had hesitated and then tried to cover it with a quick response, told Miss Marple that Margaret Drake had recognized it. It wasn't the lavender she had expected. It was something else. And that small, anxious shift was all Miss Marple needed to know there was more to Margaret's story than she was letting on. Miss Marple stood for a moment, letting the silence stretch out. The constable had returned to his post, looking slightly perplexed, but Miss Marple's gaze was fixed firmly on Margaret. "Do you remember, Mrs. Drake?" Miss Marple said softly. "The last time you were in this house?" Margaret's eyes flickered, and her lips parted as though she had been caught off guard. But she quickly regained her composure, her expression now colder, more controlled. I don't know what you mean." "Ah, but I think you do," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle yet knowing. "It's clear, you see, that you know this scent, though not from any recent experience. Perhaps you encountered it a long time ago. Perhaps it reminded you of something you thought you had forgotten." Margaret opened her mouth to speak, but the words failed her. The brief crack in her mask was enough. Miss Marple had her now. The past had surfaced in the form of an almost imperceptible reaction to a smell that had stirred memories of something darker. "You see, Mrs. Drake," Miss Marple continued, her voice steady and confident, "the flowers you smelled once belonged to someone else, a woman named Lily Ashford, and I believe you were once quite close to her." Margaret's face drained of colour, the shock evident in her eyes as the truth slowly sank in. The flowers had betrayed her, and now Miss Marple could finally see the full extent of the deception. The moment Margaret Drake's face blanched with recognition, Miss Marple knew the walls were beginning to close in. Her calculated observation, the subtle psychological test, had worked precisely as intended. The carefully concealed connection between Margaret and Lily Ashford was no longer hidden in the shadows. It was out in the open, and Miss Marple felt the weight of the truth pressing down on the room. But before she could push further, the air in the room shifted, a strange and sudden unease flooding the atmosphere. As Margaret stood frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief, there came a knock at the door. It was sharp and insistent, interrupting the delicate tension of the moment. Miss Marple paused, allowing the constable to step forward, his uniform stiff and formal. "Excuse me, Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight, "but we've just received word from the evidence locker. There's been a problem. An issue." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. She glanced at the others, who remained silent but for the faint rustling of their shifting feet. It seemed almost too coincidental, the timing of the knock. She nodded slowly. "Go on, Constable," she said, her voice steady, though her mind raced. "There's been a break-in," he continued, his eyes lowering briefly before meeting hers. "A crucial piece of evidence is missing. The letter we recovered from Mr. Ashford's safe, the one detailing his financial dealings with the deceased. It's gone. Vanished." For a moment time seemed to slow. The detective's thoughts churned, her mind grasping for answers, even as her body remained still. A piece of the puzzle had been stolen, nothing less than the most damning evidence in the case. It was no accident. Someone had deliberately worked to erase the truth, to bury it beneath the weight of secrecy. Miss Marple knew that the stakes had just risen dramatically. "Who had access to the evidence locker?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying an undeniable edge. The constable shifted uncomfortably. "Only myself and Sergeant Haynes, but—" "Only the two of you?" Miss Marple interrupted, her gaze sharp. "Did either of you notice anything unusual, anything out of place?" He hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his features before he spoke. "No, nothing. It was locked, the usual procedure, but now it's gone." The silence in the room deepened, the weight of the accusation hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Miss Marple's mind was already calculating, already turning over the possibilities. Who could have known about the letter? Who would have had the motive to destroy the evidence just when the investigation was gaining ground? She turned to the group of suspects, her gaze sweeping over them with deliberate slowness. "Someone in this room is working against us," she said quietly, the words like a ripple through the stillness. "Someone who doesn't want the truth to be uncovered. It's no longer just about finding the murderer. Now we must find the traitor who is helping them." A flicker of nervousness passed over the faces of the suspects, but none of them spoke. Gabriel Ashford's eyes darted to the window, his hands gripping the arms of his chair as though he could somehow will himself out of the room. Olivia Merrick's face was a picture of perfect calm, but Miss Marple noticed the slight twitch of her fingers, a subconscious betrayal of her composure. And Margaret. Margaret was now pacing the floor, her lips pressed together in a thin line, her mind visibly racing. "The question now," Miss Marple continued, her voice soft but carrying weight, "is not simply who committed the murder, but who has the most to lose if the truth is revealed. Who stands to gain from the destruction of this evidence?" At that, the tension in the room thickened. The stakes were now clear. Someone in their midst was obstructing justice. But Miss Marple's thoughts were already beyond the theft. She needed to understand the motive behind the theft, and who was desperate enough to eliminate the key that could unlock the entire case. The constable, whose face had grown pale with the realization of what had just occurred, moved quickly to the door. "I'll need to report this, Miss Marple. It's critical." She nodded once, her eyes still locked on the suspects as though measuring them one by one. "Yes, do, and I will have more questions for all of you. We must uncover who is responsible for this act, or the killer may slip through our fingers." As the constable left, Miss Marple turned to face the others. "I suggest we reconvene later today. I'll need to gather more information, but I trust you all understand the gravity of the situation. The person who took that letter is just as guilty as the one who took a life." The door closed behind the constable with a soft click, and the room once again fell into an uneasy silence. It was Olivia who spoke first. "Miss Marple, what do you intend to do?" Her voice was tight, though she tried to keep it light, her eyes betraying an undercurrent of nervousness. "I intend to find the truth," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice carrying an undercurrent of resolve. "And nothing will stand in my way. You may rest assured that the thief is not going to succeed in burying the past." The suspects exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them dared speak again. The air in the room was thick with the weight of what had just happened. The letter, the crucial evidence, now gone. But in Miss Marple's mind, she knew something they didn't. The disappearance of that evidence was the final clue. It wasn't just a desperate move, it was an admission that the thief knew exactly how close Miss Marple had come to the truth. A cold realization swept over her as she glanced at the window, her mind sorting through every detail, every word spoken, every movement observed. The game had changed, but she was no longer at a disadvantage. If anything, this act of desperation had put her on the right track. She turned back to the group. "We'll reconvene tomorrow," she said, the finality in her voice unmistakable. "But before you leave, I suggest you remember something. The truth always has a way of resurfacing, no matter how hard one tries to bury it." And with that, she turned, the faintest smile tugging at the corners of her lips. The pieces were falling into place. The following day dawned with an eerie stillness that hung in the air, as though the entire house was holding its breath. Miss Marple had not slept well, her mind racing through the web of clues, trying to untangle the threads that had already begun to point in the wrong direction. She had known it from the start. The theft of the letter was no simple act of desperation. It was a calculated move, a final attempt to cover up something far more sinister than any of them had realized. The constable had promised to keep her informed, but there was no word from him yet. Miss Marple had decided to meet with the suspects, again certain that the solution lay somewhere in their midst. She would press them, corner them, and force the truth to reveal itself, just as she always had. She arrived early at the Ashford estate, walking with her usual calm, methodical pace, her mind sharp and focused. The house was still. The servants were about their chores, and the rest of the household seemed to be in some sort of stifled limbo, waiting for the inevitable questions to come. The scene was unchanged from the day before, yet everything felt different now. The stakes had escalated, and there was no going back. Miss Marple entered the sitting room where the suspects were already gathered, waiting in silence. Gabriel, Ashford, Olivia Merrick, Margaret Drake and Mr. Carrington were all present, each one wearing the thin veneer of calm, but Miss Marple could see through it. They were nervous, hiding something, and that was exactly what she needed. Before she could speak, however, there came a knock at the door, a sharp, sudden sound that sliced through the tense atmosphere. The constable stepped in, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Miss Marple," he said in a breathless voice, "there's been another incident. We found Mr. Carrington. He's dead." The room fell silent, the words hanging in the air like a dark omen. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to remain composed. This was no accident. The game had changed again, and now they were facing something far more dangerous. "Where?" she asked quietly, her gaze fixed on the constable, not allowing her emotions to betray her. "Where was he found?" "At the edge of the estate, near the woods," the constable replied, his voice trembling. "It looks like he was struck from behind. A blunt instrument, we think, but that's not all." Miss Marple felt a tightening in her chest, though she masked it with a calmness she didn't quite feel. "What else?" "The letter," the constable continued, his eyes darting nervously to the others. "The one that was stolen. It was found beside him, covered in blood." Miss Marple stood stock still, processing the information. The theft of the letter had now taken on an entirely new significance. It wasn't just a robbery, it was a message, a deliberate attempt to throw suspicion, to confuse, to mislead. Someone was working against her, trying to stay one step ahead. But Miss Marple wasn't about to be fooled. Without a word, she turned toward the group, her eyes scanning each of their faces. They looked like the very picture of innocence, yet Miss Marple knew better than to trust appearances. "We need to leave immediately," she said, her voice steady. "Lead the way, Constable." The group followed her out to the scene of the crime, where the body of Mr. Carrington lay cold in the morning light, surrounded by the faint trace of blood and the discarded letter. The body was still, its position unnatural, as though it had been thrown carelessly aside. Miss Marple crouched beside him, examining the surroundings with quiet scrutiny. The letter, stained with crimson, was crumpled near Carrington's side, its contents smeared and unreadable. But the sight of it, so close to the body, told Miss Marple everything she needed to know. The killer had been playing a game of deception, and now the pieces were falling into place. "Who found the body?" she asked, not turning her gaze from the scene. The constable hesitated. "A gardener. He was passing by and saw the body in the clearing. He ran to get help." Miss Marple stood, her mind whirring with thoughts. There was something strange about the positioning of the body. It wasn't just a random attack. It was as though the killer had planned to leave a message, to stage the scene in a way that would point to something else entirely. But what? She walked slowly around the body, her eyes scanning the ground, looking for anything out of place. And that's when she saw it, barely noticeable at first, but impossible to ignore once her eyes focused on it. A faint trail of footsteps, leading away from the scene. They weren't deep, not enough to suggest a struggle, but they were deliberate. Whoever had done this hadn't been in a hurry. They had taken their time, making sure everything was just right. The footsteps led toward the woods, toward the same direction where the constable had said the body had been found. But there was no sign of a struggle there, no blood, nothing to suggest a confrontation. It was as if the killer had been waiting, lurking in the shadows. "I want to speak to each of you again," Miss Marple said, her voice cold, her gaze sweeping over the group. "Now." The suspects filed back to the house, their faces drawn, eyes shifting nervously. They knew things were about to escalate. Miss Marple could sense it. But one thing was clear. No one was above suspicion anymore, not even the constable. They returned to the sitting room, and Miss Marple took her place before them. Her mind was a blur of possibilities, but one thought stood out. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The murderer was still among them, and they were getting desperate. But why kill again? Why take such a risk? "Someone is playing a dangerous game," Miss Marple said softly, her eyes narrowing as she studied the room. "And whoever they are, they've just sent a very clear message. It's not just about hiding the truth anymore. It's about keeping you all silent." There was a pause, and then Margaret Drake, her face pale, spoke in a trembling voice. "You don't think—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "I think," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "that we need to move quickly. The next crime may already be in motion. We need to act before it's too late." The room fell into a tense silence. No one knew who would strike next, but Miss Marple's mind was already racing ahead, already thinking 5 steps beyond. The villain was still several moves ahead, but Miss Marple wasn't about to lose the game. Miss Marple sat in the parlour, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup, lost in thought. The others were scattered around the room, speaking in hushed voices, exchanging glances. The tension in the air was palpable, yet Miss Marple had no intention of joining their quiet unease. She was focused entirely on the puzzle before her, piecing together the fragments of information that had come to her so far. The second murder had shattered the thin veil of normalcy that had once surrounded the investigation. It had also shifted the dynamics among the suspects. Olivia Merrick, once the most composed, now seemed more on edge than ever, glancing nervously over her shoulder whenever she thought no one was watching. Gabriel Ashford, usually quick to speak, had grown unusually silent. And Margaret Drake, well, she looked as if she were barely holding herself together, eyes darting nervously between the others, constantly wringing her hands. But none of them was acting quite the way Miss Marple expected. There was something off, something hidden beneath their facades. She had long learned that the smallest of actions, a stray glance or a poorly chosen word, could reveal the truth. And it was there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for her to notice. She let her gaze fall on the small details of the room. It was filled with the usual comforts, a well-worn settee, a vase of fresh flowers, an assortment of books neatly arranged on a shelf. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and yet everything about this moment felt like it held a deeper meaning. It was almost as if the room itself was trying to communicate something. Her mind wandered back to the previous evening, to the body of Mr. Carrington, to the crumpled letter found beside him, stained with blood. The connection had been obvious, yet it had felt too obvious, too easy. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the key to the case was not in what had been stolen or left behind. It was in something far simpler. A sudden realization struck her, a detail so subtle, so minor, that it had almost slipped through her mind. The misplaced object in the room. The one thing that had seemed out of place at the time but hadn't been given much thought. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The pattern wasn't in the murder. The pattern was in the aftermath, the way the suspects had behaved, and more specifically, how they had acted during the questioning. There was one comment, one small detail, that now seemed crucial. Olivia Merrick's hesitation when she was asked about the letter. "Where did you last see the letter?" Miss Marple had asked her yesterday, when they were all gathered in the sitting room. Olivia had answered quickly enough, but there had been a slight falter, a subtle shifting of her eyes. It was a small thing, too small for anyone else to notice, but Miss Marple had been paying attention. In fact, it was the key to the entire case. Olivia had known too much, and that was the final piece. Olivia wasn't just a witness, she was involved. Her mind now raced through the facts again. The letter, the strange silence of Gabriel Ashford, the unexpected reactions from Margaret Drake, the earlier disappearance of the evidence, and, above all, Olivia's carefully cultivated composure. Everything had been too orchestrated, too smooth. But why? What had prompted Olivia to act this way? Miss Marple's eyes flicked across the room, and then, as if the answer had been waiting for her all along, it struck her. Olivia's position had always been one of power. She had been the closest to the Ashford family, the one who seemed to have the most at stake. But power, Miss Marple knew, was a dangerous thing to possess, especially when it came at the cost of something more personal. Greed, revenge, or perhaps even the need to control. These were the motives that could drive someone to kill. The pattern was simple once she recognized it. Olivia had been trying to cover up something that had been threatening her position. The letter, which had now come to symbolize both the crime and the cover-up, had been her undoing. It wasn't just about hiding a piece of evidence. It was about erasing a past that threatened to unravel her carefully constructed life. But how had she pulled it off? What was the connection between Olivia and the others? Miss Marple sat back in her chair, letting the pieces settle in her mind like pieces of a broken mirror coming together to form a clear reflection. She glanced over at Margaret Drake, who had been particularly agitated ever since the second murder. Her hands twisted around her shawl, her eyes darting from one person to the next, as though she couldn't decide whom to trust. Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the slight tremor in her hands, the way she constantly shifted in her seat. Margaret was involved too. She had been there when the letter went missing. She had been there when the first murder occurred. But what was her role? And why did she seem so afraid? Miss Marple's gaze flicked back to Gabriel Ashford. He had been the quietest of all, withdrawn and distant. But there was something else. A coldness in his demeanor, a stiffness in his movements that had been growing more pronounced with each passing day. He was hiding something, but what? Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes scanning the faces of the group. A faint smile played at the edges of her lips, but it wasn't one of satisfaction. It was a smile that said she had figured it out, and it was only a matter of time before the rest of them did too. Perhaps, she said slowly, drawing their attention, it's time we revisit the letter. Perhaps it holds more answers than we've given it credit for. The room fell silent, and the tension grew thicker, like a fog rolling in over the group. Miss Marple could see the shift in their expressions. Each of them was beginning to realize that the game had changed, that everything they had thought they knew was about to be turned on its head. And as the moments ticked by, Miss Marple allowed herself the smallest of victories. She could see it in their eyes. The pattern had emerged, and now the chase would truly begin. The room was still, the air thick with tension as Miss Marple's words lingered in the air. The look of realization had passed over every face in the room, and now they waited, each of them uncertain, each of them holding their breath as they anticipated the unraveling of the truth. Olivia Merrick, Gabriel Ashford and Margaret Drake all sat there caught in a web of suspicion, each wondering if the others had begun to put together what Miss Marple had so carefully hinted at. There was a long, uncomfortable silence before Miss Marple spoke again, her voice soft but filled with undeniable clarity. "The letter," she said, her gaze sharp as it swept across the room. "It wasn't just a piece of evidence to be hidden. It was a thread that tied everything together, but not in the way you think." She paused, letting the words sink in. Then, with a quiet, almost imperceptible sigh, she continued. "You see, I've been considering the motives of everyone involved in this case. Greed, power, jealousy. They were all logical assumptions, and each of you had a reason to act. But none of them not truly explain why the crime escalated the way it did. There's something deeper beneath the surface, a buried truth, one that's been concealed for far too long." The three suspects looked at each other, their faces a mixture of confusion and wariness. Miss Marple could see that they were trying to hold on to their composure, but she could also sense the cracks in their facades, the faint tremors of nerves beneath their masks. "You," Miss Marple said, turning her attention directly to Olivia Merrick, "were the first one to catch my attention, not because of your actions, but because of your words, or rather, the hesitation in your words. The letter wasn't just a means of silencing a potential threat. It was a confession." Olivia's face paled, but she quickly regained her composure, her lips tightening into a thin line. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice betraying only a hint of uncertainty. Miss Marple's gaze never wavered. "You see, that's where the mistake lies," she said gently. "This crime was not about what you thought you were protecting. It wasn't about power or reputation, not even about the family name. It was something far more complicated, something that twisted your perception of the world around you. It was about something you believed you couldn't escape." Olivia's hands clenched tightly in her lap, the only outward sign of the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. "Perhaps," Miss Marple continued, her voice growing firmer, "the letter wasn't just a document to hide. Perhaps it was the key to a past you didn't want anyone to remember, a past you hoped would remain buried forever." Olivia's breath hitched. Miss Marple could see the struggle in her eyes, the quiet battle between maintaining the facade she had so carefully constructed and the truth that was now inching its way into the light. "Did you think you could bury everything that happened years ago? Did you believe no one would ever find out?" Miss Marple asked, her tone like the sharp edge of a knife. A small sob escaped Olivia's lips, but she quickly suppressed it, turning her face away. The room fell into a deep silence, the weight of the revelation settling over them like a blanket. The truth, it seemed, was now painfully clear. "The crime was never just about power, Olivia," Miss Marple said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was about guilt, the kind of guilt that gnaws at your soul, the kind that makes you do things you never thought yourself capable of. The letter you tried so hard to hide. It was a reminder, wasn't it? a reminder of a time when you believed you could escape the consequences of your actions. But now, the past has come back, and there's no hiding from it any longer. Olivia's shoulders trembled, and with one final, resigned breath, she turned back toward Miss Marple. The mask had shattered, revealing a face twisted with remorse, shame, and most of all, fear. I never meant for any of this to happen, she whispered, her voice shaking. I was so desperate to keep it all hidden, to make sure no one found out about what we did. Margaret Drake's eyes widened, and she leaned forward, her voice trembling. What do you mean, we? What are you saying, Olivia? Olivia's eyes flicked briefly toward Gabriel Ashford, who had been sitting in silent disbelief, watching the unfolding scene with growing tension. His jaw clenched tightly, and his hands, once resting at his sides, were now balled into fists. It wasn't just me, Olivia said softly, almost as if confessing to herself, as much as to the room. Gabriel. He was involved, too. We made a pact, you see. We thought we could protect ourselves. We thought we could erase the past, but when the letter resurfaced, when it was found in Mr. Carrington's study, I realized we couldn't run anymore. Gabriel's face hardened at the mention of the pact, but he said nothing. Miss Marple, however, could see the tightening of his features, the unease that had begun to take hold. Margaret looked from Olivia to Gabriel, her mind slowly piecing together the fragments of their confession. What happened? She asked, her voice low, yet urgent. What are you hiding? Olivia swallowed hard, her eyes flicking toward Gabriel, then back to the others. She seemed to be battling with herself before finally speaking the words that had been weighing on her for so long. It was a child, she whispered. A child we lost, years ago. We thought it would never come back to haunt us. But the child's father, he never stopped looking. And when the letter was found, when he came forward with proof of what we'd done, we realized the danger we were in. We were desperate to keep it hidden. We thought we could make it all go away, that no one would ever find out about our past. The room fell into a stunned silence as the weight of Olivia's words settled over them. The truth was more shocking than anyone had expected. The crime was not just about greed or power or even revenge. It was about a secret so dark, so deeply buried, that it had driven these two to unimaginable lengths to protect it. Miss Marple remained silent for a long moment, her gaze steady as she watched the broken remnants of the people before her. She had known it all along. The true motive was never about anything so simple. It was something far deeper, something rooted in guilt and fear, the kind of fear that could make people do things they would regret for the rest of their lives. The revelation, while shocking, had brought them one step closer to the truth. But there was still one last question to answer. Would anyone ever be held accountable for the crimes that had been committed all those years ago? The silence in the room had settled like dust in an abandoned house. Olivia, her face a mask of guilt and fear, and Gabriel, sitting rigid with a barely contained fury, were at the epicenter of the storm Miss Marple had orchestrated. Margaret Drake looked as if the ground had been pulled from beneath her, her mind trying to piece together the confession she had just heard. The room seemed to shrink with every passing second, and the tension thickened like the inevitable crack before a thunderstorm. Miss Marple remained calm. Her quiet composure had been a steadying force throughout this investigation, and as the truth of the past unraveled before her eyes, she could feel the pieces of the puzzle locking into place. Olivia's eyes darted around the room, seeking an escape from the weight of her own words. But Miss Marple could tell that it was already too late. There was no escape now, not from the past, and not from the consequences of their actions. Gabriel broke the silence first. His voice was low, strained with frustration. "You don't understand," he said, his hands clenching in his lap. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. We were just trying to protect ourselves." Miss Marple raised a hand, signaling him to stop. "No, Gabriel. You weren't trying to protect yourselves. You were trying to bury the truth. But you see, truth has a way of rising to the surface, and when it does, there's no hiding it. Not from me, not from anyone." His jaw clenched, and for a moment he looked as if he might say something more, but then he fell silent. Olivia, on the other hand, was trembling now. Her eyes kept flicking toward the door, but Miss Marple had anticipated this reaction. She knew exactly what Olivia was thinking. "Let me guess," Miss Marple said softly. "You were thinking of running, weren't you? You thought you could escape one more time." Olivia's breath hitched, and she lowered her gaze to the floor. "It's too late," she whispered. "Isn't it?" Miss Marple didn't answer at first. Instead, she allowed the question to hang in the air, the weight of it pressing on them all. She could feel the storm swirling inside Olivia, the inner turmoil that had been festering for years, the desperation to avoid facing the truth of what she had done. "You tried to escape," Miss Marple said at last, "but you couldn't outrun your past, and now you can't outrun the consequences of your actions either." Margaret, who had been sitting quietly, processing the enormity of the confession, finally spoke. "What happens now, Miss Marple? Will they be arrested?" The detective turned to her, her eyes still as sharp as ever. "The law will have to take its course. But let me make one thing clear, Margaret. This crime, all of this, was not born from a single moment of madness. It was an entire web of lies built on one small mistake after another. And as for Olivia and Gabriel, they thought they could hide behind secrets for the rest of their lives. But in the end, they couldn't hide from themselves." Gabriel's face turned a deep shade of red. "We never meant for anyone to get hurt," he shouted suddenly, his voice cracking. "It was just supposed to be over. No one was supposed to die. We didn't want this, not like this." His outburst echoed off the walls of the room, but Miss Marple remained unfazed. She had seen this kind of reaction before, guilt spilling over, the pressure of years of deception finally coming undone. "No," she said quietly. "No one wanted anyone to get hurt. But that's often how things go when you make one wrong choice. And for you both, that mistake came many years ago, and the consequences of it were only going to grow as time passed, until someone was left with no choice but to act." At the mention of someone, Olivia shot her a glance, her eyes narrowing. "In suspicion, you're saying someone else is involved? Someone else in all of this?" Miss Marple's expression didn't change. "You haven't been entirely honest with me, Olivia. You've tried to hide the truth from everyone, but I believe there's someone else who's been pulling the strings all along. And no matter how much you try to bury the past, it always finds a way to resurface." Gabriel shook his head, his face darkening with confusion and fear. "What are you talking about? There's no one else. No one but us." But Miss Marple was certain. The pattern, the clues, they all pointed to something more. A small detail, a seemingly innocuous interaction, had been the key to everything. She had long suspected that the true villain behind the whole affair had been lurking in the shadows, manipulating things from a distance. But now, as the final confrontation unfolded, she could see it clearly. "You didn't kill Mr. Carrington," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but firm. "It was someone else. Someone who knew what you had done. Someone who knew that you had secrets you would do anything to protect. And they've been watching you, waiting for the right moment." Olivia's face went pale as the realization hit her. She looked towards Gabriel, her eyes wide with panic. Who do you mean?" she demanded. Miss Marple remained composed. "I believe you know exactly who I mean. The one who had the most to gain from silencing Mr. Carrington, and the one who's been hiding in plain sight, watching you both unravel." Gabriel's breathing quickened, and he stood abruptly, his eyes darting about the room as if expecting someone to step out of the shadows. "This is madness," he shouted. "You're wrong. We're the ones who—" But his voice faltered as the door to the room suddenly opened, and in walked the last person anyone expected, Thomas Carrington. The room went deathly silent as Thomas Carrington, very much alive and with no signs of injury, stepped into the room. His eyes, dark and calculating, swept over the group before landing on Olivia and Gabriel. "Did you really think you could kill me and get away with it?" he said, his voice cold and steely. "I was never dead, Miss Marple. I've been watching you all this time." A collective gasp filled the room as the truth finally clicked into place. The real game had always been one of deception, and Miss Marple had set the perfect trap, catching the villain in their own lies. Thomas Carrington, it seemed, had been the one manipulating them all along, pulling the strings from behind the scenes, pushing them to the brink of madness, and now it was all coming to an end. Miss Marple remained calm, her face as unreadable as ever. "I believe, Mr. Carrington," she said, her voice calm yet tinged with the satisfaction of victory, "that your game is over." The room stood still as the truth of Thomas Carrington's survival settled over them. For a moment, there was nothing but the slow, shallow breaths of everyone in the room as they tried to process the impossible reality in front of them. Olivia and Gabriel were both standing now, their faces ashen, their eyes darting between each other and Carrington. Miss Marple, however, seemed unfazed, her sharp eyes betraying none of the inner calculation that was still at work. "I'm sorry, Miss Marple," Carrington said, his voice devoid of emotion, "but I had to make sure you were all playing by the same rules. I couldn't risk you uncovering everything too soon." He paused, his gaze flicking to Gabriel. "You thought you could outsmart me, didn't you? But it's always been about controlling the narrative. And now that the game is over, we can all finally see who was really in charge." But Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed, unwavering, as she watched the man who stood before them. Something in her expression shifted ever so slightly, as if a new layer of understanding had clicked into place. It wasn't just about Carrington. Not anymore. "You were very clever, Mr. Carrington," Miss Marple said softly, "but not clever enough." Carrington's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" She remained silent for a moment, watching his reaction carefully, as if waiting for the last piece of the puzzle to fall into place. Then she spoke again. "You weren't the only one manipulating things from behind the scenes." The room seemed to shrink once more as her words echoed. Everyone turned to her, confusion and disbelief written across their faces. "Carrington's Smirk faltered. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice now tinged with a faint trace of unease. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "I think it's time you realized that while you were busy orchestrating your plan, someone else was watching. Someone who had far more reason to make sure you were exposed than anyone else in this room." Carrington's smug expression faltered for a moment. "Who else could there be?" he spat, but there was an edge to his voice now, a crack in the facade. "Someone you didn't expect," Miss Marple replied quietly. "Someone who knows you better than you thought. Someone who could have been in this room all along." The tension in the room thickened, and for a split second, Carrington's face betrayed something that resembled fear. He took a small step back, his eyes narrowing. "You're bluffing," he said, but the uncertainty in his voice was unmistakable. Miss Marple didn't flinch. She knew she had his attention now. "I think you're overlooking the fact that not all of the evidence has come to light," she continued. "For instance, the small detail you assumed was insignificant. The blood-stained cufflink you left behind." A flash of recognition passed over Carrington's face, but it was gone before he could mask it. His hand instinctively reached up to his collar, as though to adjust the very cuff that had been mentioned. Miss Marple noted the reaction with a careful glance, but she wasn't finished yet. "That cufflink," she continued, "wasn't just left by accident, and neither were the others you planted in the car. You thought you'd managed to cover your tracks, but you made one fatal mistake. It was all part of the distraction. The real question wasn't whether or not you were dead. It was about where you had been hiding before the moment of your death." The entire room fell silent, and Carrington's jaw tightened as the realization began to settle. His eyes darted toward Gabriel and Olivia, as if trying to gauge their reactions, but neither of them spoke. Both were trapped in the web Miss Marple had spun, each caught up in the intricate puzzle she had uncovered. Miss Marple took a step forward, her expression calm and measured. "But you weren't the only one who thought they could manipulate things. Someone else had far more to gain from your little game. Someone who knew exactly how to make you fall into your own trap." Carrington's face went pale, and for the first time in the investigation, his cool, collected demeanor cracked. His eyes locked onto Gabriel. "You," he hissed. "You knew." Gabriel stepped back as though struck. "I didn't know," he whispered, almost pleading. "I didn't. I just—" "You didn't need to know, did you?" Miss Marple interrupted smoothly, her voice calm but carrying a weight that silenced them all. "You were just another pawn in the game, Gabriel. A pawn who was used to set up Carrington's fall. The real mastermind was never Carrington. It was you, Margaret." Margaret Drake's face drained of colour, and for the first time since the investigation had begun, she looked truly afraid. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The revelation seemed to choke her, and the weight of Miss Marple's accusation hit her like a physical blow. "You didn't think I noticed the little slip-ups, Margaret?" Miss Marple continued, her voice soft but insistent. "Your nervous habits, the way you seem to appear at just the right moments, your sudden knowledge of details you couldn't possibly have known. It wasn't an accident. You were pulling the strings all along." Margaret took a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she held onto the edge of the table. "No," she said in a barely audible voice, shaking her head. "I didn't. You played the game just like Carrington did, didn't you?" Miss Marple cut in, her eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "You and Carrington were working together all along. The false evidence, the staged murder. It was all part of the plan to make sure that no one suspected you. But in your haste to get rid of the competition, you miscalculated one very important thing. You underestimated me. Margaret's hands tightened, her knuckles turning white as her gaze dropped to the floor. There was no more denying it. The truth was finally out. Just as it seemed everything had fallen into place, the last twist, the real mastermind, the quiet figure behind the grand scheme, had been uncovered. The game had changed, and for the first time, everyone in the room was truly aware of just how far the web of deception had stretched. The silence was deafening. Miss Marple had won, but she knew that this victory wasn't just about solving the crime. It was about exposing the dark depths of human nature, the lengths people would go to protect their own lies. As Margaret sank into her chair, defeated and exposed, Miss Marple stood still, her mind already moving forward to the final steps of the case. There was still much to be done, but for now the truth had triumphed, and with it the last pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place. The room remained still as the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Margaret Drake, now utterly defeated, slumped in her chair, her face pale, her hands still gripping the edge of the table. Her eyes darted around the room, a mixture of panic and defiance flashing across her features. It was as if, in that moment, she was still searching for some escape, some way to slip through the tightening noose that Miss Marple had so carefully placed around her. But Miss Marple was unwavering, her sharp gaze never leaving Margaret. The weight of her words had struck true, and the detective's mind moved relentlessly, already piecing together the aftermath of this long and winding case. "You've been clever, Margaret," Miss Marple said softly, her voice the calm amidst the storm that was brewing in the room. But cleverness, when driven by a need to conceal the truth, always leaves a trail. You wanted to be the mastermind, to control the narrative, but you underestimated something, someone more perceptive than you thought. Margaret's lips parted as though to argue, but no words came out. Miss Marple's expression softened, with an almost imperceptible trace of sympathy, the kind reserved only for the most intricate of cases, those where the true villain wasn't born from greed or malice, but from a twisted sense of survival and desperation. At the heart of this, Miss Marple continued, was your need to be in control, to hide behind the chaos you created. But you couldn't hide from me, Margaret. The smallest inconsistencies, your attempts to make yourself the victim, the way you manipulated the timeline, the false evidence planted to cover your tracks, those were the cracks I saw through from the very beginning. Margaret's eyes narrowed. And yet, here I am, she hissed, her voice suddenly hard. You think you've won, but it's all still a game. Nothing's over. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her tone was firm. The game has always been about more than the crime, Margaret. It's about the truth. And the truth, as you know, has a way of coming to light. Even in the darkest corners, it will find a way. Margaret was silent now, her defiance replaced by something far colder. She knew, as well as anyone in the room, that the final act of this drama was approaching, but what that would look like remained unclear. Carrington, still standing, with his arms crossed, glanced at Gabriel, his expression unreadable. Gabriel's face, however, had remained locked in a tense, unreadable stare since Miss Marple's last revelation. He was no longer the desperate figure caught in the middle of the web of deceit. He was now part of something larger, something beyond his control. Miss Marple turned back to Margaret, her calm demeanour a stark contrast to the storm brewing in the room. "I believe we both know where this goes from here. The truth cannot be buried forever, and soon it will be in the hands of the law." Margaret's lips curled into a bitter smile. "The law?" she echoed with a laugh that sent a chill through the room. "What makes you think that's where this ends? You've won for now, Miss Marple, but I won't be the last you hear of this. You think you've caught me in this little trap, but you're mistaken. You're all mistaken." The weight of her words hung in the air, and for a brief, terrifying moment, Miss Marple felt the unease slip beneath the surface of her composed exterior. But only for a moment. "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, her voice unwavering. "You think I've missed something, that you still have a chance to escape. But you won't. The truth is too far along, and the evidence too clear for anyone to believe in your games any longer." Margaret's eyes flickered with something like panic, but it was quickly replaced with a mask of cold composure. She stood up abruptly, moving toward the door in one swift motion. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," she said, the finality in her voice unmistakable. But just as quickly as she moved toward the door, she froze, her fingers hovering over the handle as a sound from the far side of the room halted. A gentle knock on the door. It was soft, yet unmistakably there. Miss Marple's eyes moved toward the door with the barest hint of a smile. "You've underestimated one last thing, Margaret." The door opened, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered figure in a dark coat. It was Inspector Hamilton. He stepped into the room, his face grim but resolute. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice steady, "I believe it's time we brought this matter to its conclusion." Margaret froze, her face paling, the weight of the unexpected intrusion settling in. "You," she began, but her voice trailed off. Hamilton stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Margaret. "I've been following your trail for a while, Margaret. You may have thought you'd outsmarted everyone, but there's a reason we always catch the ones who think they can escape the truth." Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward Hamilton. "You were always one step behind, Inspector," she said, her voice full of quiet confidence. "But now, you're here at the right moment." Margaret's expression twisted, and in the blink of an eye, her demeanour shifted once more. She looked to the door, then to Hamilton, her mind clearly racing, seeking some last-ditch effort to escape. But the walls had closed in too tight. There was no more room for manoeuvring, no more chances to manipulate the situation. "Enough games," Hamilton said, his voice cutting through the tension. "We've already found the evidence we need. Your
false trails, the lies, the manipulation, it all ends here."
Margaret hesitated, her face a mask of suppressed fury, and for a brief moment it seemed as though she might fight back. But then, as if defeated by the weight of it all, she slumped. Her shoulders sagged, and she exhaled deeply, the fight drained from her. Miss Marple stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Margaret. "The truth has caught up with you," she said softly, though there was no sympathy in her tone. "Now, justice can be served." As Hamilton moved forward to make the arrest, Miss Marple lingered behind, watching Margaret closely. She had unravelled the deception, discovered the hidden threads that connected it all. But even now, she could see the flicker of something deep within Margaret's eyes, a stubborn, defiant spark In the end, justice had been delivered, but the unsettling sense of unfinished business remained. Miss Marple knew that not all villains could be contained by mere walls, and that sometimes even the most calculated of criminals would find a way to escape. But for now, the truth was out, and that was enough. At least for today. The weight of the case seemed to settle in the air, a mix of finality and unsettling anticipation. As Miss Marple walked away from the small, cluttered office, her steps were slow, deliberate, the heels of her shoes clicking against the old wooden floor with a rhythm that matched her thoughts. The case had been solved. Margaret Drake had been arrested, her web of deception unraveled, and justice was on its way. Yet despite the conclusion, something lingered. It wasn't the triumphant feeling one might expect after such an intense investigation. No, it was something far subtler, an unease, a nagging doubt that tugged at the edges of her mind. Miss Marple's instincts had never failed her before, and now they whispered, soft yet insistent, that there was more to this than met the eye. As she stepped into the dimly lit hallway of the police station, her thoughts drifted back to the smallest of details, the letter she had found in Margaret's desk. At first it seemed like an inconsequential scrap of paper, an afterthought. But now, after everything that had transpired, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that it contained something more, something hidden beneath its hastily scrawled words. She recalled the words written in an elegant but hurried script. The past never stays buried for long. The message had seemed cryptic at first, but now, with the case wrapped up and the villain behind bars, it gnawed at her. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the way they had been written. So precise, so deliberate, almost as though Margaret had known, deep down, that the end wasn't really the end. Miss Marple, Inspector Hamilton's voice broke through her reverie. She turned to find him approaching, his face softened by the weight of the case's resolution. "I wanted to thank you. I don't think we would have gotten this far without your insight." Miss Marple smiled, her expression kind yet thoughtful. "You did most of the work, Inspector. I merely pointed out the things that others overlooked." Hamilton hesitated, glancing toward the exit where Margaret Drake had been taken. His brow furrowed. "I still don't understand it, though. Why all the deception? Why the lengths she went to frame others, to make us believe in a story that wasn't even real? It just doesn't add up." Miss Marple's smile faded slightly. She placed her hands behind her back, her gaze distant. "That's the question, isn't it? There's always a motive behind the crime. But sometimes it's not what you expect. What we see on the surface isn't always the truth. But the truth has a way of coming to light eventually. Sometimes it's just a matter of waiting for it." Hamilton looked at her curiously. "You don't think it's over, do you?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately, instead focusing her gaze on a distant corner of the station. There the shadows seemed to stretch just a bit longer than they should, as if the very walls held secrets still untold. "I never think it's over," she said finally. "There's always something more." She glanced down at the floor, her mind whirling back to the conversation she'd had with Gabriel earlier, where he'd spoken of a past that seemed so out of place with the person he had become. She thought of how each piece of the puzzle had been so carefully crafted, how Margaret's lies had taken shape over years of patience. But Miss Marple had learned something long ago. There is always a thread, no matter how thin, that leads to the truth. Sometimes the most innocent-looking thread unravels a far deeper mystery. And then there was the matter of the letter, the one she hadn't mentioned to anyone yet. What if it wasn't just a message from a desperate criminal? What if it was a warning, a clue that there was someone, or something, still watching, still waiting, in the wings? Hamilton's voice pulled her from her thoughts again. "I know."
You, Miss Marple, you're already thinking about the next case, aren't you?
She met his gaze, and for a brief moment she allowed herself the indulgence of a quiet smile. "I've learned that, no matter how many cases are solved, there is always another waiting in the wings. And sometimes the most unexpected ons are the most dangerous." Hamilton's face softened, the understanding passing between them. He had seen it before, the glimmer of a mind that could never rest. "You're not the retiring type, are you?" Miss Marple's smile widened just a fraction, though there was an edge to it now, a quiet, knowing edge that came only with experience. "I suppose, Inspector, you could say that I've never truly retired." As she turned to leave, her mind was already working, piecing together the fragments of this case and the pieces that didn't quite fit. The words of the letter echoed in her mind, and as she reached the door, she hesitated, one hand on the handle. The past never stays buried for long. It wasn't just a message. It was a promise that someone or something was watching, waiting. Margaret had been the pawn in a much larger game, one whose true architect remained hidden, lurking in the shadows. Miss Marple stepped out into the cool evening air, the door clicking softly behind her. The streets were quieter now, the bustle of the day having given way to the silence of the night. But in her heart, the mystery wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She could already feel the pull of the next case, the next puzzle to unravel. The one where the truth was waiting just out of reach, ready to be uncovered. The game wasn't finished. Not for her. Not for anyone. Not as long as there were mysteries left to solve. And somewhere, in the darkened corners of the world, there was someone who knew that Miss Marple was always just one step behind, waiting for the next move. The mystery, as always, was never truly over.